The UFC has officially signed Kayla Harrison, and this will be the first time she will be competing at bantamweight.
Personally, I've never seen a weight cut of this magnitude, not necessarily even just in female athletes, but in MMA athletes across the board. It's a seriously risky business. Losing 30 pounds to try and get down to 135, it's a significant amount of weight that she's got to cut in a reasonably small amount of time. If you were to go back, let's say 5 to 10 years, that science didn't exist and it was all just sort of a finger in the air. This is what we think will work. This is just based on experience. What this is and what this weight projection is all about is taking into account the scientific literature. My name's Tom Coughlin. I'm a sports nutritionist with more than 7 years experience working with professional athletes and teams across a range of different sports, including those in weight class categories like we're going to discuss today. This whole video is how I would approach Kayla Harrison's weight cut down to 135 pounds for UFC 300. So I think before we get started into how I'd weight cut Kayla Harrison, I think it's really important to have a bit of a disclaimer, which is that this approach is based on the really limited objective data that we have about this situation. We know that she needs to weigh 135 pounds on a specific date, but everything outside of that is really up to assumption. So what I've done is made some little assumptions based on her walk around weight, where she tends to sit and what that has been shown to be in the media. I've then combined that with my knowledge of this area, as well as my knowledge of the scientific literature, and that's how I've approached what this weight cut would look like. I do not know Kayla Harrison, I don't know her team, I don't know any confidential information about what approach they're taking to this camp. This is purely from an outside perspective. So I think we should really start with the only bit of objective data that we have, which is on the 12th of the 4th, at the weigh-in, Kayla Harrison needs to weigh 135 pounds, ideally in the morning. That's pretty much all that we know at that standpoint for absolute fact. We can then build back from there. So really we come up with these questions here. At the starting point, at the point where she signed this contract, where is she at? Where is her natural walk around weight? And from what I've seen in the media, that tends to be around 165 pounds. So I'm assuming that when she signed that contract, at the point of the press release, at the point where she decided to take that fight at UFC 300, that is where she is. We can also tell from an outside perspective that she is well muscled and lean at that point as well. And all these things are factored into how I would approach this weight cut. We've obviously got different phases of that as well that I'll dig into. So the dieting phase, the weight cut itself on fight week, and then also a little bit about recovery and how she can optimize her performance going into UFC 300 too. So again, like in any weight cut process, a nutritionist like myself is only one part of a much bigger puzzle. If I'm ever working with an athlete in any sort of weight cut, or generally any sort of way, I want to be part of a multidisciplinary team. Because if I work with an individual just from one perspective, there's a bit of a risk that my information will all be siloed and not take into context the bigger picture with regards to the athlete and how her training's being affected, her health, how her training and her coaching from an MMA perspective is also being affected too. So it's really important that you try and build up a bit of an MDT around the athlete themselves. So like I've got here, you've got myself as the nutritionist. An S&C coach is probably going to be a really important part of this process as well, from a physical programming standpoint, to look at training load, training periodization, recovery, and some monitoring too. You've also got MMA coaches obviously need to be a really important part of this. They will give you direction as to what the training is going to look like, the kind of skill development, the tactical and technical element of that training camp. And as well, you'd want to have some oversight from a doctor here to provide that medical oversight, just to give some areas of expertise that you may not necessarily be able to cover. from any qualified individual, you will have a set amount of things that you can go into with that athlete. It's really important that you don't step out of what you're actually qualified to do, and that's why an MDT is absolutely crucial. The important part of this process is that there's communication and trust across all those elements, including with the athlete themselves, and they have a seat at the table to be able to dictate the kind of approaches that you take. If you start to do one thing just by yourself as a nutritionist, I could give them a diet plan to follow that is completely misaligned to their physical training program or the technical and tactical elements that their MMA coach is trying to present. There's obviously going to be connections as well, let's say, between the nutritionist and the S&C coach with regards to monitoring, the doctor and the nutritionist in terms of hormonal adaptations and these sorts of elements here. So yeah, communication is the number one thing, and there's no particular set order of who does certain things at certain times. When it comes to the timeline, again, I've based this on the limited objective data that we have. So starting off 24th of the 1st, 24, which is when we got announced that Kayla Harrison was going to fight at UFC 300. What that leaves us with is essentially a 10-week dieting phase, which is the first traditional phase of a weight cut. We then have a 7-day weight cut phase leading into the weigh-in on the 12th of the 4th, and then you've got UFC 300 evening of the 13th. So although it might seem like a fairly long period of time, actually when you consider the journey that Kayla's got to do from 165 down to 135 and then up to her fighting weight, it's not actually that long a period of time. And there are issues that I'll go into that I've sort of put here: low energy availability, low protein, relatively low carbohydrate, that we'll dig into. And there are a massive amount of risks involved with this process. What that timeline allows us to do is essentially project what her weight's going to do. And I've got many different equations, bits of spreadsheets, data that I've put in essentially what her training plan looks like, and therefore what her diet needs to look like to get her to that weight. So we start off here 165 pounds. This is us at the date that we're filming today. If she's around 153.8 pounds, then she's on track as far as what I've proposed this weight cut looks like. If she's heavier, I'm very skeptical that she'll actually be able to make that weight on the night of UFC 300. So at the end of that dieting phase, that 10-week dieting phase, ideally she'd be at 146.8 pounds. And that's where the weight cut starts, the actual dehydration, dietary manipulation to get her down to 135. Once she gets down to around about 140, that's when we'll look at some water manipulation, getting down that final few pounds to 135, and then rocketing back up to around 148.5 pounds on fight night. I'm not going to say that it would be a complete linear process with regards to dropping weight. It's much rather the case that you will see some up and downs, going all the way down here to the point where you will hopefully be around 146 pounds. So typically when you're talking about a weight cut, especially one that involves dieting and an actual water cut or weight cut in that final week, there are risks involved. Typically people tend to think that they're around the weight cut itself. So that fight week, because of either a lack of eating, dehydration, you've essentially got a lot of athletes that have that depletion over performance mindset when it comes to achieving weight, essentially fighting the scale rather than actually doing their job on fight night. The other side that does pose risks, and I believe poses more risks for Kayla in this circumstance, is the dieting phase. There's a number of reasons why that I'll go through, but just as a couple of headlines, low energy availability is a real risk for Kayla. Risk of the female athlete triad, as well as risk of developing something in the literature known as REDS, or relative energy deficiency in sport. And because it's such a severe dieting phase that she's got to engage with, I believe that's where the real risk lies in this process. So low energy availability is one thing that's getting a lot of attention in the research, especially over the past few years. What it is essentially after exercise and after minusing the calories that you burn through exercise, does the body have enough calories to support all physiological functions? So normal stuff like keeping your heart beating, making sure your liver, your kidneys are functioning optimally, all sorts of stuff there. And in the research, there's different categories of energy availability that are commonly referred to. So this is specifically for female athletes. Optimal energy availability is calculated as above 45 calories per kilo of fat-free mass per day. So it's all based on stuff like your body fat percent, how much muscle or muscle and bone do you have available. So optimal energy availability, that's where you want to be with regards to performance as an athlete. You want to be around that. You will get the most out of your performance and you'll be able to support your body in all its physiological functions from a health standpoint as well. If you eat less than that, so that's around 30 to 45 calories per kilo of fat-free mass, that's what's referred to as subclinical energy availability. And that can be tolerated for short periods of time because you will need to be in that to drop body fat and to make some body composition adaptations with regards to that sort of context. But again, that's short periods of time. If you have subclinical energy availability for a long period of time, there can be some issues that come out of that from a health standpoint. And also performance as well will probably be impaired somewhat in subclinical energy availability. Clinical low energy availability is less than 30. And that's the point where it's a real risk of developing negative health issues that I'll run through in a bit. But with regards to Kayla and her dietary setup, she is going to be in clinical low energy availability for around 10 weeks. Again, if we look at the research, low energy availability for as little as 5 days has been shown to have issues with regards to hormonal function, normal hormonal function in the body. So that's 5 days. This is 10 weeks. And this is one of the reasons why, from a professional standpoint, if I was presented with this case study almost, or Kayla Harrison was to come up to me and say, I've got essentially 10 to 12 weeks to make weight and I've signed for 135 pounds, I wouldn't really want to engage in that process. I would certainly present my risks, say, yes, you can do it, but the question should be, should you do it instead? And I don't necessarily think it's the most ethical thing for someone to push their body that much with the amount of risk involved, even just from low energy availability. But this is one part of a much bigger picture when it comes to risk. One of the other risks associated with low energy availability is obviously the duration. Subclinical low energy availability may be tolerated for short periods of time, especially for periods of weight loss, which is very common in a lot of sports. But like I've said before, the issues that can arise can be in as little as 5 days. So there was a study here by Lux and Thurm in 2003. Some of those issues with regards to hormonal function presented themselves in as little as 5 days. Kayla Harrison's going to be in clinical low energy availability for 10 weeks. So the risk of something bad happening with regards to health is very high. Again, like Kayla's current situation here, based on her diet, what I think she needs to restrict her dietary intake to in order to make that weight is around 15 calories per kilo of fat-free mass per day for 10 weeks. So that's half the cutoff point for clinical low energy availability. Now, low energy availability, it might not be the be-all, end-all for weight cycling athletes based on some of the data that we've seen previously, especially that published by Carl Langen-Evans. However, 15 is still low, regardless of that study that I'll talk about in a second. In terms of the prevalence of LEA, it is very common in certain sports. The presence of it does depend on the sport. So, for example, female endurance athletes, artistic, aesthetic sports, or weight class sports, low energy availability is a lot higher risk for those athletes because weight is a significant part of their sport. So usually there'll be some form of dieting around any of those kind of sports. So with regards to MMA and low energy availability in MMA, there is limited data apart from some of this stuff by Dr. Carl Langen-Evans. So he's a researcher out of Liverpool John Moores University. He's a real expert in this field of weight cutting and weight category sports. He's also competed at a very high level in Taekwondo, I think it was. So he's got that academic expertise combined with the applied side of stuff as well. What he did in this study was he observed with a group of colleagues what happened during an 8-week fight camp with an MMA fighter who competed at bantamweight. In this particular study, they found no adverse consequences for physiological systems of this athlete based on 7-week dieting phase of 20 calories per kilo of fat-free mass per day. And that's referring to energy availability. But do bear in mind that Kayla is less than that, and for an extended period of time as well, an extra 2 weeks compared to this study. He has also, Dr. Carl Langan-Evans, got some unpublished data looking at female athletes using a similar setup to what they did in this study, and again showed no particular issues over an 8-week period. But again, this is a much more severe weight cut that we're looking at compared to that unpublished data. So yeah, there are real issues with regards to saying this is the case in male athletes, this is definitely going to be the case in female athletes. They're two completely different things. So in terms of the outcome, like I've said before, low energy availability categorization, so for example, greater than 45 kilos fat-free mass per day, all the way down to less than 30, it may not be entirely relevant to MMA based on that previous literature that we've seen, but Kayla's diet is more severe and for a longer period of time compared to that data that's been published. It's going to be 15 calories per kilo fat-free mass per day energy availability for 10 weeks rather than 20 calories for a 7-week period. So it's more severe. So the risk of some of those health consequences is going to be a lot greater. One of the things that has got a lot of traction over a number of years now in the research when it comes to female athletes is the female athlete triad. And this is something that is certainly going to be high risk for Kayla developing over this weight cut. Low energy availability is one part of that, essentially underfueling. You've also got things like decreased bone mineral density. So your bone health is going to be impaired quite a lot as well. That's associated with things like low estrogen levels, lack of vitamin D, reduced protein synthesis generally from that low energy. You're simply not giving the body enough calories to function normally. And you may also have instances of clinical osteoporosis. And you've also got menstrual dysfunction as well. Obviously, the menstrual cycle is a really complex area. And one of the reasons why so much research is just focused on male athletes, because focusing on female athletes can be a real pain. But we do need to understand that process in a lot more detail. There's started to be a good amount of research coming out over the past few years looking at the effect of the menstrual cycle on performance, recovery, health, stuff like weight cutting as well, general things like body temperature too. So we're starting to get more data and a greater understanding of how that plays into the equation when it comes to female athletes. But when you're in low energy availability as a female athlete, your risk of menstrual dysfunction is incredibly high. So either irregular periods or complete loss of a period known as amenorrhea. So this whole research, female athlete triad, was built off the fact that when coaches, nutritionists, doctors, S&C coaches were working with female athletes over a long period of time, they noticed these 3 symptoms coming up a lot. And so therefore it got developed into this model of the female athlete triad to be able to hopefully help people identify issues that might come up when they're working with their own female athletes. That's one part of what is now referred to as a much bigger system, which is that of relative energy deficiency in sport, or REDS. So as we can see here, we've got impaired bone health, impaired reproductive function, irregular menstrual cycle, impaired hematological function as well, which again, we go back to that TJ Dillashaw example, classic symptom of relative energy deficiency. And that's probably one of the reasons why he used EPO, was because of this process. He was underfueling himself so much. So Kayla is I'd say high risk, or certainly one of the highest risk athletes that I would see given this approach for developing relative energy deficiency. And you can see here, it's not just a couple of things that this process can affect in the body. There's a huge amount of physiological processes that can get impaired before we even get to the weight cut. And that's why this period, the dieting phase of her weight cut, is so high risk. Alongside that, you've got other risks, like the risk of illness, obviously massively increases. You can imagine simplistically, if the body's not getting enough calories, it's not going to be able to go through the processes to fight off normal illnesses and things like this, infections. Intense training does impair innate and adaptive immunity. So you're going through a fight camp, you're going to be training quite hard anyway, so your immune system is going to be impaired. Low energy availability reduces that immunity further. Adding on to that some of the other features that we see associated with REDS, like poor sleep, that even more so reduces immunity. So the risk exponentially increases of getting ill. If she didn't get ill throughout this whole camp, I'd be amazed, to be honest, given what we've already gone through. So if she was to get ill, at best, it might be a few days training that you miss. But at worst, that could mean developing illness when traveling to an event. What kind of implications does that have for the weight cut process? It could be the case that she misses the weigh-in altogether or misses weight because she's at high risk of illness. Now, there are strategies that you can do to help mitigate some of that risk. However, it's really difficult to try and balance the risk versus how you can mitigate it. It's still going to be massively increased. Certain nutritional strategies like use of vitamin C or zinc lozenges when traveling, just generally paying more attention to hand hygiene, hygiene in general. But you're at a point here where you're probably at your lowest in terms of fueling the body. You're at your most vulnerable, and then you've got to travel to an event, go on a plane where your risk of illness is massively increased anyway. So this is a real area of concern, or certainly would be from my professional standpoint. It's obviously not just illness, there's an injury risk as well. In terms of the evidence, this study, Hikura and colleagues in 2018 found that injury risk is 4.5 times higher when athletes are in low energy availability compared to when they're fueling properly. We obviously know from this instance or this circumstance that we're looking at, Kayla is going to be in low energy availability for a prolonged period of time. I think anecdotally, a lot of MMA athletes do say that they've been injured at some point during camp. There's that saying of, you never go into a fight at 100%, that gets bandied around a lot. This could be one of the reasons. Again, chronically underfueling or going through massive periods of severe dieting can increase the risk of injuries happening. And again, the diet severity, so the greater the energy deficit or the greater the length of time that you're in low energy availability, the greater the risk of developing an illness is. I've said here, this is something that I've thought about a lot as a practitioner, which is I would love to see some proper research looking at the discrepancy between athletes' natural walk-around weight and their fight weight, and then have a look at the incidences of injury that happen across that time. I think that would be a really interesting study. And certainly from my perspective, I think the bigger that difference is, the bigger that discrepancy, the higher the incidence of injuries would be. One of the final issues with a weight cut like this or dieting phase like this is that you will have a relatively low carbohydrate intake, and that come fight week does leave you with less tools in the toolbox, because one of the main ways that you can help cut body weight safely is through glycogen manipulation. Essentially, if you've got more glycogen available in the tank, or if you've been fueling well throughout camp, you'll be able to cut more body weight through reducing that glycogen that's stored in the muscles. Whereas if you've had a much more severe diet, you'll be using up that energy all the time, and you won't have big stores of energy or glycogen in the muscles to then cut as part of that weight cut process, which can therefore put more pressure on some other elements of making weight, for example, dehydration, which again is all about managing risk in this process. If you can fuel better more often throughout fight camp, you will then have more tools in the toolbox when it comes to actually cutting weight, and then there's less pressure on things like dehydration and other areas that could potentially increase risk of other health consequences and things like that. Because of all these risks that we've gone through already, that's why this process is absolutely crucial, which is the monitoring side of things. And unless you are working with a really well organized and well-funded team around you, you probably won't be able to do a lot of this. And again, it increases the risk. You don't want to be just putting your finger up in the air and deciding, right, this is what we're going to do. You want to have a data-driven, objective approach to what you're doing with regards to fueling, dieting, training, everything when it comes to athletes. It's more predictive. It's ideal being able to understand where you might be going rather than just guessing at the end of the day. I'd say MMA is a sport where pseudoscience and gurus, performance gurus, unqualified practice is one of the highest that I've seen personally. The standard of some of the people that are working in the industry is absolutely dreadful. That's not to say that everyone's dreadful. There are some absolutely class operators that are, I'd say, like the gold standard of weight cutting and working in MMA from a nutrition standpoint. But they are severely outweighed by the amount of pseudoscientists, snake oil salesmen out there, unfortunately. And when it comes to a process that is as significant as we're discussing today, I don't know how you balance that equation. It's just that there's so many people that, from a practitioner standpoint, obviously don't care about the athlete and they just want to make money. They want to get their own name out there. This is an area that if you get wrong could have severe health consequences for that individual. And as a practitioner, you need to care about that individual, and that individual's health is absolutely number one priority. But for a lot of these people, it doesn't seem that that's the case. Day one, Kayla Harrison approaches me with, this is what I want to do. I'm trying to get as much information as possible, objective data, right at the very start. So that would be, for example, body composition assessment, ideally via DEXA scan. From that, you can get some great information on fat mass, fat-free mass, body fat percent, also bone mineral density. If we go back and think about low energy availability, relative energy deficiency, bone health is absolutely top priority. So this is one of the reasons why we want to do that. DEXA is one of the gold standards of assessing body composition. You can also establish resting metabolic rate via essentially gas analysis. It gives you an idea of how many calories your body requires from just resting. That will give you a good indicator of how to initially set up a diet. You'll obviously have to factor in energy expenditure into that as well from a training perspective, physical activity perspective as well. But resting metabolic rate is absolutely crucial because it gives you a good understanding of how to build your diet initially. How many calories does this person need at rest? And then you can factor in other stuff like activity, energy expenditure. In resting metabolic rate, it can vary a fair amount. There are equations that you can look at that will give you a decent steer, but ideally in a scenario that is this important, I would want to go through the actual process of indirect calorimetry, which is that gas analysis. It requires quite a lot of tools and scientific equipment, but they do that kind of thing at the UFC PI, which is super important. Obviously, blood work is going to be crucial for anyone undergoing a severe weight cut like this because it will give you a good idea right at the very start of what is normal for this person. For example, you can look at stuff like red blood cell count, hemoglobin, iron, ferritin stores, testosterone, all sorts of stuff. You can even give you an idea of bone turnover, looking at things like calcium. And even with regards to hydration, you can look at plasma electrolyte content as well. So what is normal electrolyte content for this athlete? And that's going to be super important come the actual weight cut, especially if you're looking at water manipulation. Also, Carl Langan-Evans has used a bit of heart rate and blood pressure monitoring as a form of stress response. Some of those indicators are linked to low energy availability, or they can certainly be indicators of low energy availability. Very simple, very cheap to be able to employ too, so I don't see why people would not use that process. It's very simple, very cheap, could be quite useful. I would also want to establish sweat rate. So that can obviously be really important given prediction of weight cut. So when you're looking at water manipulation, especially if you're doing any sort of passive dehydration, using a sauna, any sort of training related sweat losses, that's going to be really important because it gives you more data to then inform, right, how much can we actually lose over this period of time, given these kind of training scenarios that we're going to go through. Obviously, I do want to use it as well for hydration status throughout camp. So what I do with most athletes is I assess their sweat rate, and therefore for any training session that we do, I can give them an idea of how much water they should drink throughout that training session, but also how much they might need to rehydrate with afterwards. So general hydration status throughout camp, but specifically for this purpose, it can be really useful given that weight cut scenario. Obviously, menstrual cycle plays into this equation as well. Just having an idea of the different phases and tracking of phases can be useful. Now, I'm not going to lie and say I'm a complete expert in this area. It is an incredibly complex process and it's not that well understood. However, there is some research looking at, for example, the luteal phase, carrying some implications for weight cutting, specifically with regards to body temperature, potential sweat losses, and some areas have been associated with water retention as well. Obviously, that has implications for that weight cut scenario, so understanding if that's going to fall on fight week could potentially be quite useful. It just is another bit of information that you can then discuss with your team and the athlete themselves. Is this maybe the best fight to take at this particular time point? Yeah, you have also had instances in female MMA athletes undergoing weight cuts where people have overstepped the mark and prescribed things like oral contraceptives to help control some of those hormones that can impact these areas. Was the famous one with George Lockhart prescribing oral contraceptives for Cyborg during one of her weight cuts, which is a complete step out of what his remit is. I mean, you could argue that he's not even a nutritionist, given his qualifications, let alone a medical practitioner that can prescribe something like that. So I remember reading that at the time and thinking that is just a perfect example of the quality of nutrition practitioner in MMA. It's a real issue, and yes, there might be a reason to do that, but it's not his choice. It's the athlete's choice in conjunction with an actual medical licensed professional. Oral contraceptive use in female athletes is very high. It's around 50% for some of those reasons. Not necessarily always weight cutting, but for example, mood, performance, recovery. It can be a tool, but that's not up to you as a nutrition practitioner to dictate that. That's an athlete's choice alongside good advice from a qualified medical practitioner. One of the other really key parts of monitoring is training load, and that's why having a really good relationship with the S&C coach is crucial, because that allows you as a nutrition practitioner to estimate energy expenditure. Like, again, having actual gold standard measures of energy expenditure is very difficult, but what we can do is use some predictive models, potentially looking at things like heart rate as well in some predictive models, to give you a steer on how much energy expenditure an athlete will be having on a day-to-day basis. Because that essentially gives you, this is the amount of wiggle room I have with regards to diet. This is what I'm going to build the diet around. Energy expenditure first, then macros, hydration, all those elements. Again, this is one of the assumptions here. I don't know specifically what Kayla Harrison is doing with regards to her training, but from a few interviews that I've seen, she says trains 3 times a day, 6 days per week. So I've made my assumptions and my estimates, my predictive models based on that. Typical MMA training structure, and I've estimated it's around 1,600 calories a day of activity energy expenditure that Kayla Harrison will have on those day-to-day bases. Obviously adding in to that equation the resting metabolic rate. And those two things combined together give you the blueprint for how to build the diet. So now we can actually get into the nitty-gritty of how I would approach this from a dietary perspective and how we would get Kayla from 165 all the way down to essentially 146 to then weight cut that last bit down to 135. So the dieting phase, the main aim of this, she's got 19 pounds to lose in 10 weeks, 1.9 pounds per week. that will leave us with the outcome that with 7 days pre-weigh-in, she would weigh 146 pounds, leaving a 7.5% weight cut in the final week. So pretty straightforward as far as that goes based on the literature. What we'd also have to factor in from that performance perspective is the periodization of that diet. Now, you might be familiar with that notion of periodizing a diet, but if you're not, it's essentially how you design that diet to get the most out of performance whilst also paying attention to the overall goal of, let's say, losing body fat or maybe gaining muscle. In this circumstance, it's just weight loss. So what I tend to do is match the calorie intake to the demands of the day minus the energy deficit. So for example, if she's got a really heavy training day, we put more calories in on that day. If she's got a recovery day, we have less calories in on that day. Fat and carb intakes, we'll keep those as high as possible in the restrictions that we've got, given the fact that we need to create a calorie deficit every single day to get her down to 146 in that period of time. We'd also look at having carbohydrates around performance-based sessions, especially with regards to, let's say, sparring or sessions that her coach believes are really important. We'd look at manipulating the carbohydrate content so it's based around those sessions, either before or after. I would also probably want to employ something called a sleep-low approach, which is originally established by Marquette and colleagues in 2016, which looks at restricting carbohydrates at certain times of day to potentially get some performance-related adaptations to training, or potentially increasing fat oxidation as well, that might be quite useful in this circumstance of a weight cut. Sleep low is essentially after your last training session, you restrict carbohydrates in the evening, you then sleep with low carbohydrate availability, you're putting your body under slight amounts of stress, but that can help increase some of these muscular adaptations to training. You can then combine that with something like a fasted morning cardio session to then potentially get some further benefits, and then using carbohydrates after that period of time throughout the main part of the day where she's going to be most active. Again, it can be a little controversial using an approach like that, but I think given this circumstance, it's something that athletes tend to like to buy into as well, and it makes sense from a performance fueling standpoint. You can also look at, during periods of low carbohydrate availability, something like carbohydrate mouth rinse, so not actually ingesting the carbohydrates, but swilling it around in the mouth and then spitting it out, and that's been shown to actually help improve performance in some of those sessions. You see it a lot in football athletes, especially when you're competing in hot environments. It's oftentimes quite difficult to actually take on fluid and drink the energy and fluids and calories that your body needs. So this can almost be a little alternative while still working within your restrictive carbohydrate guidelines. You're still getting some of those performance benefits. Hypertrophy is a really interesting one when it comes to this dieting phase as well, because typically athletes is all about building as much muscle as possible, improving strength, improving power, potentially getting some aesthetic benefits as well. But what we know about Kayla is she is, I'd say, above average musculature for a female athlete. And actually that's going to be quite detrimental to achieving 135 pounds. So this approach from my standpoint would be about mitigating any hypertrophy that would happen over that time. So any kind of muscle gain, we want to avoid that throughout this whole dieting phase. Then you essentially reverse engineer what a normal athletic diet is. So you'd have it as low protein as possible, so around 1 gram per kilo of body weight. Typically, most athletes will be in the 1.8 up to maybe 2.2, 2.3 grams per kilo, but we'd keep it low because we want to avoid muscle gain. We'd also want to try and reduce the amount of protein per serve as well, so typically less than 20 grams per serving, as well as having it quite low quality with regards to leucine or particular amino acids. Leucine is one of the main stimulators of muscle building, muscle protein synthesis. So we want to choose protein sources that are low in that amino acid. Typically stuff like plant-based protein sources would be a good option for Kayla during this dieting phase. You can also look at stuff like increasing antioxidant content post-training, stuff like vitamin C, vitamin E. You could even look at something like tart cherry. This is all based on research done by Paulson and colleagues in 2016, which showed that if you have antioxidants after resistance training, it actually blunts that hypertrophy response and blunts your body's ability to adapt to that training and get gains out of it. So we're essentially using that, but maybe not in the way that it's originally thought. So we're using that to help blunt those adaptations because that's the goal. Also, again, communication with S&C coach is absolutely crucial here because we would want to limit resistance training volume. A lot of the work of Brad Schoenfeld, all these experts in the field have shown that if you want to gain muscle, resistance training volume is one of the main stimulators of that, if not the main stimulator. So we want to keep the resistance training to as little volume as possible. So people like Joe Rogan, they love an ice bath. And whilst that can be quite useful for recovery, it's not good for training adaptations generally, with regards to especially building muscle hypertrophy. There was a study published last year by Pinero and colleagues that showed that if you have any sort of cold therapy, that could be an ice bath, it could just be cold water immersion. If you have that after a resistance training session, you're essentially blunting all those adaptations to training. Again, something that a lot of athletes will want to avoid, but for this circumstance, we want to use it because we want to reduce that muscle mass with Kayla. So after any sort of resistance training that she's doing, maybe after most stressful other training sessions with regards to sparring, striking, grappling, an ice bath would be quite useful. And again, I'd want to discuss that with her S&C coach, her MMA coach, to look at how we apply that in the whole training picture. Also, an increasing cardiovascular training volume has been shown to help reduce that muscle mass over time. That's something that typically a lot of MMA athletes will do. That's probably something that Kayla will do as well to help her achieve that weight. In terms of where that leaves us, so in general overview on a day-to-day basis, on most training days, Kayla would be typically eating around 2,800 calories per day and around 320 grams of carbohydrate on that day, which does sound like a fairly decent amount, but we've got to bear in mind that it's relative to the amount of training and the demands of that individual. It's not like me sitting here today. If I was eating that, I'd probably gain weight. But the circumstance that Kayla is in, that's significantly underfueling herself based on her training volume, where she's currently at and where she needs to get to. On a rest day, it would be a lot less than that, so around 1,800 calories a day. Again, it's periodized to the amount of training volume that you're doing. Less training, less calories, more training, more calories, more carbohydrate. Protein and fat would be exactly the same regardless of training. So we'd be looking at 75 grams of protein per day, 110 grams of fat per day. Boosting that fat up slightly more than is normal, just because that might help to stabilize some of those hormonal levels, just support that process as much as we can. And again, that does result in a weekly energy availability of around 15 calories per kilo of fat-free mass per day, which does put her in clinically low levels. And this is one of the reasons why I'd be quite adverse to actually doing this in the first place. But if I had to, I think this might be one of the safest ways of doing so. So once you've completed that dieting phase, you're then left with the fight week, which is this 9-day period. So that is a weight cut phase of 7 days leading into the weigh-in, and then you're shifting that focus into recovery and potentially onto performance as well. But you can obviously see there's a big discrepancy there between the amount of time that it takes to diet, then weight cut, and then recovery is this tiny little bit at the end. So I've obviously got some notes here looking at from 7 days out through to the weigh-in. This is the typical approach that we want to take. Generally, the aim at this point, if we've done things right, this will leave Kayla with 7.5% drop in body weight to achieve 135 pounds. If we look at some of the published data from the UFCPI, female fighters' average weight cut during this time is 4.5 to 6.6%. So this is slightly more. You could argue that because Kayla has a higher muscle mass, it could potentially be easier for her to cut some elements of weight, specifically with regards to hydration. But again, this is probably that balance between really high risk for the dieting phase and then risk for the weight cut phase as well. It's all about risk management. So the 7 days worth of glycogen depletion is where a lot of the body weight will come from. So that would be 7 days of less than 50 grams of carbohydrate per day. So it's not a lot at all. Typically what you see from the research is people will drop up to 4% of their body weight just from employing an approach like that. It's not going to be easy, you know, not having any carbohydrates, but just a slight dietary change like that can result in a significant amount of body weight that you can lose just from that dietary manipulation. As far as what I would want out of this process, because Kayla's been in a period of relatively low carbohydrate availability, she probably doesn't have a huge amount of glycogen to then cut. So I would be aiming for around 2% glycogen depletion at this point, not going all the way up to 4. There's no point expecting that when I don't believe she would have that amount to play with. We'd also look at employing a low fiber diet as well. So that would be 3 days pre-weigh-in of less than 10 grams of fiber per day. Again, that's based on research coming out of Liverpool John Moores University from Fu and colleagues in 2022. From that kind of approach, you'd be looking at around a 1 to 2% drop in body weight, just from essentially having a low residue diet and removing all the excess stuff that's sitting in the gut. Just trying to have that as efficient as possible, trying to eliminate what's stored in here as much as you can. Again, for this process, we'd be looking at the higher end of that with Kayla, so around 2% drop in body weight from having that low fiber diet. You can also look at a bit of water manipulation as well, and thankfully we've got some really good research published by Reel and colleagues back in 2017 looking at a 3-day water load and then a 1-day water cut. For Kayla, that would look like 6.6 litres per day for 4 days pre-weigh-in, and then you're looking at less than 1 litre during that cut the day before the weigh-in, and then having nothing before actually weighing in on that day. Typically from this kind of setup that is well established across good practitioners in MMA, you'd expect a 2 to 5% drop in body weight. So it can be quite useful of a tool to employ. Again, for Kayla, we're looking at right in the middle of that. So 3.5. So 3.5 added to that 2% for the low fiber, added to that 2% for the glycogen depletion, that gives us with our 7.5% drop in body weight without a huge amount of effort, hopefully. Again, we've got to have a lot of good communication with Kayla at that point during that process to help manage what it all looks like, make sure that she's comfortable, as well as getting good data from the doctor, S&C coach, MMA coaches as well. As well as this, depending on the kind of training that you're employing during that fight week, you might not have to have any sort of passive sweating, for instance, using a sauna or anything like that. Especially what I've set out here, we would have pretty much no passive sweating employed at all. It would just be normal sweating through training. No need for any sweatsuits or anything like that. Given the right data and the right approach that we've had here, and you see this with a lot of good practitioners and their athletes, the likes of Jordan Sullivan, they don't actually use a lot of passive sweating unless they have to. It's a tool in the toolbox, and that's the approach that we would take here. To help support that water cut, we'd have a look at using a low sodium intake of less than 500 milligrams a day as well for a 3-day period leading into the weigh-in. And that would just help support that fluid excretion. Actually, most of the advice I give with regards to electrolytes and performance is having some of the electrolytes, especially sodium after exercise, can be useful for water retention, helping to improve that fluid balance. Obviously, we're looking at the reverse of that here. We want to lose those fluids. And so having a low sodium intake can help with that process. Hopefully, employing a process like that would allow Kayla to drop from 146 down to 135 pounds fairly easily after that big dieting phase that we've gone through. But again, communication is absolutely key in this area. This is a plan. It might not always go to plan, and that's why you need to have that communication. Just as a visual from that water manipulation research, this is exactly what it would look like for Kayla. So just above 6.6 litres per day for 3 days, having less than a litre on that cut, having nothing pre-weigh-in, and then you switch into that recovery focus. And to help replenish the body with fluids, you're looking at approximately 30 mils per kilo lost of body weight times 150%, because you will excrete some of that fluid that you ingest. It doesn't all just stick around. You still got to go to the toilet. So that's why you account for that and you rehydrate with 150% of the fluid that you've lost. Typical fluid intake for most athletes is around that 2 litres to 4 litres. So it is a fair amount more that you're having during that water manipulation phase. What that actually does in the body is that plays around with antidiuretic hormone, or a compound known as arginine vasopressin. That really can control fluid balance, or controls whether you should retain or excrete water. If you're overloading that system for 3 days, that will help you eliminate water when you cut it out finally, because there's a bit of a delay of that effect. So it's super useful to use for this very purpose. Obviously, if you play around with water manipulation too much, there can be real issues there. But this is a controlled, safe way of doing that and getting the benefits when it comes to cutting weight. Just to visualize that process, we start at around 146 pounds, if not up towards 147 pounds, dropping down over that 7-day period to 140. And then finally, you've got a bit more of a steep decline there when it comes to that water restriction. 135 pound weigh-in, and then rocketing back up to 148.5 pounds in that recovery phase. So it's a fairly undulating period of time when it comes to your weight. There's quite a lot of difference there. It's not like the sort of steady decrease that we'd expect over the dieting phase. It's a much more acute approach that we're taking. When it comes to weighing in, I would expect any MMA athlete to weigh in as early as possible, simply because that provides a larger window for recovery, especially when we talk about rehydration going into a fight, super important, but also from a performance standpoint, loading the body with glycogen, you want to give yourself as much time as possible to do that, to put yourself into that performance window. So many people just focus on making weight, and it's underfueling themselves chronically, and I think the amount of people that go into a fight underprepared and underfueled is absolutely huge. You want to try and optimize that process as much as possible, even if you've just got a short period of time. 24 hours is not enough by any means. Ideally, the longer the better. However, there's always a balance there. And if you've got approximately, let's say, 24, 36 hours, then that is ideal. That should be okay to get you back up to a point where you can perform. Just given the nature of, let's say, fluid reabsorption, glycogen resynthesis in the body, loading up those glycogen stores, that process does take time. And ideally, the more time, the better. In terms of that recovery window, it really does need to be controlled and planned. If you go off script, then it can really increase the risk of GI distress, so gastrointestinal distress, just feeling uncomfortable, and general fueling imbalances as well. You could load up on something that's not going to give you any energy whatsoever. Probably getting a burger, something like that. Those choices could actually impair the digestion and accumulation of that energy back into the body. So really there's 3 phases that are outlined when it comes to recovery. There's the acute rehydration that happens immediately after the weigh-in. There's that non-acute rehydration, so that's going into more the sort of 24, 36 hour period. And there's muscle glycogen restoration that happens pretty much from immediately post weigh-in, but that's the thing that's going to take the longest period of time to get back to normal. How you do that is through these 4 strategies. So fluid, again, we're looking at 150% of estimated fluid losses during the weight cut. So for Kayla, that would be 6.3 litres divided into hourly targets. If she can hit those hourly targets, take on 6.3 litres, she's going to be in a really good spot when it comes to her fluid balance going into that fight. To help support that, we'd also want to get those electrolytes back into the body, notably sodium. So we're looking at 1.5 grams per litre of fluid. And again, it goes back to the monitoring and the importance of that. If we've got data on plasma electrolyte content, potentially looking at sweat rates, some extra sweat data too, we can all individualize what those rehydration protocols look like, so we can get Kayla back to exactly where she needs to be with regards to her hydration levels and electrolyte content. If you don't have that data, again, you're just making an assumption, which wouldn't necessarily be the end of the world, but you can optimize that process by collecting good data. Carbohydrate intake, just because you're going from a period of essentially having no carbohydrate to then fueling up as much as possible, is 8 to 12 grams per kilo of carbohydrate. So very simplistically, a 100 kilo athlete, 800 to 1,200 grams of carbohydrate, which is quite a lot. For Kayla's purposes here, we'd be looking at 530 to 800 grams post weigh-in through to, let's say, the morning of the fight. So it's quite a lot that she's got to have there, which is why I'd want to divide that up into smaller meals, just make it a bit more tolerable for her, focusing on quite simple forms of carbohydrate, something that she quite likes as well, because we don't want to feed her with stuff that's, she's not going to like, not going to eat. We're essentially going to try and push carbohydrate as much as is tolerable within that restriction, up to 800 grams per kilo, up to 800 grams total. We'd also want to limit some stuff there, because again, there are risks involved with this recovery process. So we'd want to limit fiber, fat, and have a moderate intake of protein. Higher intakes of fiber and fat and protein can put excess strain on digestion, and especially on that digestive system, because it delays a process called gastric emptying, which is when you're digesting food, it's in the intestines, in the stomach. That process of getting it from the intestines and actually accumulated into the body, that's the gastric emptying. If we delay that process, then you're not going to be accumulating that energy. We want to try and make it as efficient as possible. And we do that by limiting the intakes of fiber and fat in the body, as well as potentially having a more moderate approach to protein intake during that time too, especially in the first 6 hours. And then it can be a bit more sort of personal preference after that. But if you have too many of those foods, the efficiency of actually getting the energy from that food is going to be impaired. So we still want to have it nice and controlled and planned during this recovery phase. When it comes to fight day, given all the stuff that we've gone through, there can be a bit more flexibility around what your intake is like on the actual fight day. A lot of it is personal preference from the athlete's perspective. The goal here is to really maximize your recovery the day before, so therefore there's not too much stress on fight day or on competition day. You can shift that focus to performance then. So instead of recovery, you may be shifting a bit more to the performance on that day. In terms of dietary intake, it's generally quite moderate with regards to the amount of food that you're consuming. If you've had a really good recovery day the day before, then it can just be personal preference. As long as you're having a decent amount of carbohydrates, you should be grand. Many people overeat on the fight day itself or on any day of competition across many sports, because they think, I need calories at this day, I need to load up the calories immediately beforehand. Actually, you're putting a lot of stress on the body that you probably don't need. Shift that to the day before. We've got that window with regards to fighting, we've got that weigh-in, then you've got that window of recovery, and then the fight day. Let's optimize the recovery first. Take the stress off the fight day. In terms of timing, because the fight's probably going to be around 7 o'clock, that's good because I think it's on the prelims, I would suggest that Kayla eats breakfast and lunch as normal and hydrate to thirst, because she's probably already recovered to a decent standpoint, and those bits are just the little icing on the cake. They're just going to keep her ticking over. Then 3 to 4 hours pre-fight, I recommend a snack containing 1 gram per kilo of carbohydrates, again just to sustain those good energy levels and get her body to a point where she's fueled up and ready to go from that energy perspective. You could also look at using stuff like caffeine or nitrates to enhance performance on that fight night as well. And again, those can all be individualized. The amount of data you can go into just with regards to caffeine is huge. We'd probably do like another 2 hours just on utilizing caffeine, so we won't do that. And like I said before, fight day can be quite athlete-led, because as long as you're working within those restrictions or guidelines, there's quite a lot of flexibility there, especially if you've put a lot of focus on the day before and you've optimized your recovery at that point. I think generally, just to summarize this whole topic, is making weight is an incredibly complex process, and where possible you do need to work with someone that is adequately qualified to provide you with good advice. Even from the outset, when you're considering fighting at a certain weight, you probably need to have expertise at that standpoint to help you realize if something is realistic or not. Like I said before, if Kayla came to me and said, I'm going to fight 135 pounds at UFC 300 12 weeks beforehand, I'd probably suggest that she shouldn't do that, and therefore it becomes a bit of the onus is on you as a practitioner to make a really sensible decision there and not push her into doing something, or push any athlete into doing something that is going to put them at risk of either impairing their health and potentially their performance as well. But health is the number one thing. So it's very high risk from this standpoint. When I say qualified and experienced professionals, it would be really remiss of me to not mention some of the best experts in this field from my perspective. So people like Dr. Carl Langan-Evans, I've referenced his work a lot during this. He works out of Liverpool John Moores University, highly experienced academic and applied practitioner. There's also the likes of Jordan Sullivan, the fight dietitian. He does some excellent work in this industry. Peter Miller, condition nutrition, works with a lot of one athletes as well. The UFC Performance Institute has really been a revelation from my standpoint as a practitioner. It employs that multidisciplinary team and really gives the athletes the best chance to optimize their performance and weight cut safely. That's headed up by Dr. Duncan French and Clint Wattenberg, their director of nutrition. They do some excellent work and they're very open with what their approach is too. So I highly recommend reading into some of their stuff. And of course, the Sports and Exercise Nutrition Register, that's the register that I'm a part of. That's part of the British Dietetic Association. It means I'm adequately qualified to provide nutrition advice in sporting and performance contexts. So if you've got someone who's a nutritionist that is part of the SENR, that's a big tick in the box, or someone that's a sports dietitian as well. So look for someone with those qualifications to help guide you in the most safe and appropriate way possible. I think there's clearly going to be some differences there, and I probably make some comparisons to how TJ differed from 135 down to 125 pounds. Although I think this is probably going to be more severe. I mean, Kayla is clearly an outlier as a physical specimen. She's also gone through that Olympic system. She's highly experienced. She's a real high-performing athlete. She will be completely different physiologically. What impact is that going to have on her technique? It could be huge amounts. It could be very little. We simply don't know. I think it's going to be fascinating to see how she's going to end up on the scale, and also the differences between the scale and hopefully what she walks into the octagon at UFC 300.